Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring Key Data and Findings from the 2019 Columbus Survey. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are here for the first time, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Zavala, and I'm a program manager for Candid based in our New York Learning Center. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York, and I'll be supporting this webinar behind the scenes and monitoring the questions that you submit through the chat. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to today's presenter, David Rosado, our Director of CF Insights here at Candid. The floor is yours, David.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone who's joining us on the line today. It's so great to see such a great turnout, especially on a Friday afternoon. So we do appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us this afternoon. Before we get started and start digging into the results of the Columbus survey for 2019, just a little bit about Candid. For a combined 90 years, Foundation Center and GuideStar each helped change the world by giving people the information they needed to do good. In February 2019, the two organizations joined forces to become Candid. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that everyone should have the facts. The greatest service we can provide is to be upfront about all that we know. We envision a social sector capable of tackling the critical challenges and opportunities of our time. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. And before we get into the Columbus survey results, just a little primer on CF Insights for anyone who might not be familiar. CF Insights is a service of Candid, and we ask a simple but very important question. And that is, what if each community foundation could know what all community foundations collectively know? Through CF Insights, we provide a benchmarking service for community foundations to inform their own decision-making by leveraging metrics such as growth in assets, fundraising and grant making, staff breakdowns by function, functional administrative fees, operating expenses and revenues, and so much more. We also perform research on trends in the field and provide consulting services for individual community foundations looking to better understand how their own resources are being allocated, test the impact of different market scenarios on their economic model, and much more. And today, we're going to talk about the results from our latest Columbus survey of community foundations, which hopefully all of you are already familiar with. And the survey for this year is reflecting fiscal year 2019. We'll talk about some of the key findings, and I want to spend a little bit of time discussing how you can access and leverage even more of our data as you and your community foundations make important strategic decisions. I'll also talk about how you can be a part of this data set, say a bit about what else we're working on, and then we'll open it up for questions. A bit of background on the Columbus survey, which has often been referred to as the annual census of the community foundation field. All community foundations operating in the United States are welcome to participate in this annual effort to develop a representative financial snapshot of the field. This allows us to track general growth trends in assets, gifts received, grants awarded, and more. We also report on some of the key differences and similarities in how community foundations across several asset size cohorts operate. Now, what's great about this survey is that all of our data is self-reported. So everything you're seeing today is data that's self-reported with some supplemental data from public resources if available. This allows us to customize the types of questions that we ask, including adding new ones based on the current conversations happening in the field. We're also able to collect more up-to-date information than what might be available via public documents like the 990. This, of course, means that we're not necessarily reporting on a data set of the entire field, but of those that participate with us. But what we can say is that this is a fairly consistent representative sample, given its diversity of asset sizes and geographies and communities served. And it is also a fairly consistent sample. It is a consistent sample from year to year. So that, coupled with the fact that we get strong participation from the 100 largest community foundations in the country, means that we're able to track the activity of the vast majority of the dollars held in the field for this annual snapshot. Now, how about we go ahead and take a look at some of the results together? As you probably know, our results starting about 4 years ago have been hosted at columbussurvey.cfinsights.org. And we moved away from publishing PDFs annually to help shorten our turnaround time from data collection to publication, to make it easier to issue corrections if necessary, bring in new data after it comes in, if it has an effect on the overall snapshot, and simply to just have one place where all of this data can live. Now, I did mention the shorter turnaround time, right, from data collection to publication. And there's a little reality that I need to address at this point in the interest of transparency. That turnaround time was about as short as we ever hoped for it to be. It's just merely a few weeks from closing the data set to publication. But with the ongoing pandemic, the need for community foundations, like most of us, to adapt to working mostly remotely, and community foundations focusing on their own response in support of their communities during this challenging time. Data collection just simply could not go at the pace to which we are accustomed. So, and additionally, I should mention too that we did end up getting very close to a typical sample size, but we didn't get quite as many participants as we usually get. And I'll say a little bit more about that in detail. Luckily, patterns of field diversity along asset size and geography, as I mentioned earlier, still hold true with the sample. So that that point about representation of different types of community foundations still holds in the sample. And the sample is comprised, much of the sample is comprised of long-time participants and a few first-time participants as well. But I do encourage anyone who did not or could not participate in the 2019 survey to this point to still get onto our database. You're still invited to do so, and share your information if and whenever that might be possible. If we do get enough additional data that creates shifts in any of these findings in any meaningful way, we can certainly update the site accordingly and issue any updates via our mass communication channels. Still, as I mentioned, trends that we typically observe remain in place this year. So we're confident that we're reporting, that this reporting is still backed by a solid sample. So how about we go ahead and hop onto columbussurvey.cfinsights.org and explore the findings together. So as I mentioned earlier, all of our results live on this website that we are able to dynamically update as new data come in. And to get to the latest results, you can always just, from the main site, columbussurvey.cfinsights.org, just click to see the results, and it'll always take you to the most recent year's results. And if you want to explore any prior year results, so I mentioned we started this 4 years ago, you can use the drop-down menu there at the top of any page and select the year you want to see. And of course, I do want to pause here and mention that for all of the results that we collected for 2015 and prior, you could still find those on our website. They're still all available for anyone to download. So those didn't go anywhere. Now, speaking of our survey sample, and let me get rid of this drop down here. Of that survey sample, our participant community foundations come from all over the country, representing 45 states. And I do want to take a moment here and extend my thanks to everyone who participated. Little extra recognition to the members of the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, whose members all participate in our survey every year, which is at least part of the reason why we always see such strong representation from the Midwest. Now, in order to see how many respondents are based in each region, you can simply hover over each region or click the table button to get all of the data all at once. And as I mentioned, we got respondents from 45 different states. So we do have community foundations who participated from all over the country. Now, our community foundations also serve communities of many different sizes as well. That's on this chart right here. And you can see a pretty wide split among pretty much all of these different size ranges, size of community, that is. And as is always the case, every year, no asset size cohort is represented at a far higher rate than the others. There is a little bit of a higher representation among the smaller community foundations, which actually tracks with how many more smaller community foundations there are across the country anyway. There are a lot more of these smaller community foundations than other sizes, certainly more that are under 50 million, but either way, that's going to be reflected in there being a little bit of a higher representation from that group. And vice versa, there's no cohort that's of this set of cohorts here, asset size cohorts, that's represented by far fewer respondents than the others. Something to note that I want to note right off the top here when we talk about the total assets, gifts, and grants reported for 2019 is that, and I mentioned this earlier, our sample is a little bit smaller than last year. Last year we were at 253. You can see it on the website if you go back to 2018. This year we landed at 236. So we're not too far off, but despite the fact that the sample is a little bit smaller, our total asset, total reported assets for all participants of the survey is still more than $7 billion higher than last year. That's because 2019 was a particularly strong market year in which invested assets just performed very well overall. Now, among those who have participated each of the last 2 years, the median community foundation saw a more than 15% growth in overall assets. And because we collect this data based on the fiscal year of the responding foundation, there's going to be a clear difference between those whose fiscal years end in June or earlier. Their median was a 6% increase, and those operating on a calendar year, so those whose fiscal years are 12/31/2019. The median for those was an increase of 16%. Now, you might remember that at the end of 2018, there was some significant market volatility that took place at the end of 2018, which is at least partially why there's such a major difference between those two groups. Now, our gift and grant totals are each a little bit lower than they were in 2018, not too far lower. Gifts were just above $10 billion last year. Grants were a little bit closer to $9 billion last year. So they're both a little bit down. Now, that's certainly partially due to the slightly smaller sample, as I mentioned. But if we move down the page here and we focus on the top 100 or the largest 100 community foundations for whom we have data for each of the last 10 years, so this is a consistent sample. Only foundations that have participated each of the last 10 years are featured on the sample. You're still going to see that there is a dip in both. And if I bring back the assets year over year, you're going to see that assets continued their year over year growth, while both gifts and grants are down from last year. Now for gifts, this is the first decrease since 2015. And for grant making, this is the first decline since all the way back in 2011. And I mentioned this already. What we're looking at here is a single year snapshot. So this is a difference from 2018 to 2019. So it would be a good idea for us to wait a little bit longer to see what kinds of patterns emerge if we wait a couple more years and see whether or not patterns like that continue apace. Now, of course, 2020, to say 2020 is an abnormal year is probably it's probably a big understatement. So even next year when we collect 2020 data, it's going to be a little bit challenging to draw too many conclusions based on growth rates from 2019 to 2020. But still, if we wait a little bit longer and see whether or not these trend lines continue in one direction or another, it'll be interesting to see what's happening across the field. You know, things like changes to the tax law, the increase in the standard charitable deduction, they could have an effect on fundraising, but there are more than likely going to be other factors at play here as well. Now, if we zoom back out to the entire sample, and this is all community foundations that have participated in the last 2 years, the last 2 survey years, the median change in gifts was merely 2%. Now, trend lines in fundraising are always tricky to track when there's going to be a significant portion of community foundations every year that are in one of these two buckets, this dramatic decrease bucket and this dramatic increase bucket. And what we mean by dramatic increase or decrease is a change of over 50% from the previous year's fundraising total. So this year, if we combine these two buckets together, that's about a 36%. 36% of our participants saw a dramatic swing in their gift totals in one direction or another. Most of whom saw a more than 50% increase in their fundraising. And now with grant making, you're going to see a much higher proportion of respondents in the neutral and moderate bucket. So this is the neutral bucket, and then right here, flanking it on either side are the moderate buckets, and those are less than 50% changes. And with grant making, these totals tend to change to a less dramatic degree. Over a long period of time, grant making totals will tend to increase. And that's going to bear out in the data. So 85% of all of our respondents were in one of these buckets. So very few are in either of the dramatic change categories. And in this sample, grants grew at a higher rate than gifts with a median 8% increase. Now, if we jump to the funds tab, I was actually excited to get to this section of the presentation because there are a few new questions that we asked this year that we added to this year's survey regarding donor advised fund activity that I'm going to be getting to in a couple of minutes. But first, with regard to product mix, you're going to see two shifts happen if we go from smaller community foundations to larger community foundations and the proportion of assets that are in donor advised funds, which is why I wanted to bring this up before we move on to DAF activity. So as asset size increases, you're going to see a proportion, you're going to see two things happen. One is that the proportion of discretionary funds will start to decrease from 28 to 12%, and you're going to see the proportion of donor advised fund assets increase. Now, it's not exclusive to larger community foundations necessarily, but as they specialize their services for donors and tend to be located in more populous areas with higher numbers of high net worth individuals, they will tend to have more DAFs than their smaller counterparts. Our DAF totals, donor advised fund totals for assets, gifts, and grants are basically in line with the overall totals that I mentioned on the previous tab. Slightly smaller sample, assets are up anyway, there's a slight dip in gifts and grants. Still, these DAFs are highly active grant makers in the aggregate, as is demonstrated by a few pieces of data that I'll mention now. One of those pieces of data is the flow rate that we added for the first time last year, that data point. And the flow rate is defined as a comparison between the gifts received by all DAFs, so the grants given by all DAFs. So basically, what is the proportion of gift dollars received that go out as grants in the same year? The comparison of fundraising to grant making yields some interesting data that show that for all asset size cohorts, from left to right, we're going from smaller community foundations to larger community foundations. The rate of grant making is pretty close to keeping pace with the rate of fundraising. Now, it would require a deeper analysis of individual DAF accounts to better understand how many of the dollars put into a DAF go out as grants in that same year from individual donor advised funds. But this gives you an idea of how active DAFs are, emphasizing again that this reporting is all done in the aggregate. And with distribution rates, if we focus on distribution rates for a moment, you're going to see a similar trend of very high grant making activity from donor advised funds. So and this tells us a similar story, although again, we're talking about aggregate data. Now, across all asset size cohorts, the median distribution rate for all funds of the community foundation, that's what I'm hovering over here, stays in the single digits. While in most cases, except for the very smallest, and remember the smallest community foundations have the lowest proportion of DAF assets, so there's not really a difference between the distribution rates of DAFs to all funds, but for all other cohorts here, the distribution rates of DAFs is going to be higher, and in some cases, much higher. Now, given the ongoing conversation about DAFs and DAF activity, we wanted to go ahead and add a few questions to the Columbus survey, which we did this year, to gather some information around the prevalence of inactivity policies, or policies that define a time horizon after which a community foundation considers a DAF inactive if no grant recommendations were made by the donor. Now, more than half of our respondents, 60%, say they have a policy in place to address dormant DAFs or inactive DAFs, while 24% did not answer the question. So presumably, some portion of this 24% will also have a policy. So the number of respondents that have a policy in place is likely to be a little bit over 60%. We're just not sure, but we are certain that 60% of our respondents do have a policy to address inactive donor advised funds. We also asked the number of years, basically the time horizon. How do you define your time horizon? The number of years after which DAF is considered inactive if a grant is not recommended. And very few respondents told us that they don't consider a DAF to be dormant after 5 years. So for almost all of our respondents, 5 years was the upper limit. The most common response was 3, but basically it's 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years are the most common responses, after which, again, no grants recommended by the donor, the community foundation considers that DAF to be inactive. Only 5 of our respondents, 4 said 10 years, 1 said 15 years, said that they consider a DAF to be dormant after 10 or more years, citing the potential for the donor to grow their fund over time, activating it at a later date for more impactful grant making once they build an asset base. And we also asked participants, do you have a policy, yes or no? What is your time horizon? And then what do you do with the funds after 2 or 3 or 5 years or 10 years? And so we asked respondents to tell us what steps they take when a DAF is considered dormant. And while the most common response, that's 68% here, said that they simply reach out to the donor to encourage them to activate the fund, a notable portion of our sample, a not insignificant portion of our sample, does take further steps. And 28% told us that they distribute the grant to recipients that align with the donor's original intent when they opened the fund. and 32% said that they transfer the funds into the foundation's own unrestricted fund to distribute at their discretion. Now, we did also set this survey question up to accept open-ended responses as well, in case Foundation said that they take other steps that we didn't define. But the responses we received are basically stating that they engage in some combination of these three. And several respondents also pointed out using the open-ended field to tell us that they virtually have never had to take any of these steps other than perhaps notifying the fund advisor. So it's a very rare thing that they do take one of the other two steps unilaterally. Now on the operations tab, I want to highlight the revenue mix here. This is our revenue mix data, the sources of operating revenue to support the operations of the community foundation. And this is the donut chart that represents all community foundations. And the average is that 70% of all operating revenues come from admin fees. And we can look at any individual asset size cohort, but no less than 60%, no matter which of the cohorts we're looking at, get less than 60% of their operating revenues from admin fees. For smaller community foundations, to the extent there are differences in this revenue mix from smaller to larger, smaller community foundations, more support from for operations will come from fundraising and internal endowment distributions, whereas for the larger community foundations, less from internal distributions, less from direct fundraising, a little bit more for fee-for-service offerings, such as consulting, philanthropic advising services, and other types of fee-for-service offerings. If we move down to our funds for funds per full-time equivalent chart, you're going to see two pretty clear patterns. As community foundation size increases, so too does the median number of total FTEs, total employees, while the number of funds per FTE is fairly consistent across the first three groups, but generally starts to decrease as community foundation asset size increases. And that's despite larger community foundations perhaps tending to manage much larger numbers of funds than their smaller counterparts and working with many more donors. And yes, this is partially because of the increased specialization of staff, as more employees are brought on to, yes, manage a larger number of donors, but also to focus on customized services for those donors, special initiatives, community leadership work, fee-for-service offerings, and more complex internal systems to track everything. And before we move on, I did want to mention just a friendly reminder for anybody who, for those who come to the site every year, that our 4 annual rankings lists are updated as well. And these are sorted by asset size, distribution rate, number of gift and grant transactions, and gifts per capita. And if you click on the names of any of our listed community foundations, you're going to see where they rank on all of the other metrics that are listed here on the left. So you can go to them individually and see the list for that individual list, or you could see one community foundation's full results, you can say. And you can tweet or post it to Facebook, post to LinkedIn, or email an individual community foundation's Columbus survey results card, as we call it, to share with others. And at the bottom of every page on the site, you can access the asset, gift, and grant totals for every participating foundation as an Excel file. So clicking that, you'll get every foundation that participated this year, the asset, gift, and grant totals for all of our participants as a free download. So let's talk a little bit before we move to questions about how community foundation or how CF Insights can help you. Now, you already saw our high-level findings from the latest survey, mostly presented as aggregate data, but we do also make it easy to gain access to disaggregated data and perform queries directly on our database. That's the same database that everyone used to participate in the Columbus survey itself. So as a participant, even if you're not a member of CF Insights, you gain access to several reports listed on the left-hand side of this slide that display your own data, either longitudinally or compares your growth rates over time, year over year, against your asset size cohort. So whichever asset size cohort you fit into, and as compared to the broader field as well. And as a member of CF Insights, you get access to all of our peer query tool and over 90 different on-demand reports several examples of which are listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And speaking of that query tool, members can perform lookups of other community foundations by asset size, state, the region they serve, the size of the community that they serve, the portion of assets that are endowed, staff composition, many other foundation characteristics. If you participated in the Columbus survey and you're familiar with the data that we ask for, every single data point we ask for, and a few more, I should mention, are available on this peer query tool. And you can look up individual community foundations using that tool. There's no limit to the number of peer groups you can create, and these groups will always pull in the very latest data that we have, even before we publish the aggregated findings on the Columbus Survey Results website. You'll always see the very latest data we have. With this tool, you can essentially build your own custom data sets, export them as an Excel file directly from the site, and you can create your own reports using that custom data set that you were able to generate using the peer query tool. You can also run any of our aforementioned 90 plus on-demand benchmarking reports using the peer groups you built to do things like compare the staff makeup of your community foundation to your peers and dig into how their staff composition relates to their volume of grant making activity, growth in the number of DAF accounts over time, their focus on special initiatives, and more. You can run all of our reports as a visual chart, or most of our reports as a visual chart, and as a data table. And the data table feature is great because it'll allow you to see the details behind the chart and get a fuller story of how your community foundations all compare with one another. Members can also request customized benchmarking dashboards, just like the one you see on the slide, which combine several reports in an easy to digest format, which we also accompany with written takeaways based on the data and how you compare with your peers and the broader field to provide more context to the data itself. And a new member benefit that I wanted to mention that we added just this year is discounted access to the GuideStar Local Nonprofit Directory. Through this service, the Candid team builds you a comprehensive, always up-to-date directory of nonprofits working in your community foundation service area, which you can embed directly on your own website. The example on this slide is from the Community Foundation of North Florida's website, publicly available for anyone to see. I just took a snapshot of that page and put it right here on the slide. So you can embed the directory directly on your own website to be viewed publicly, including by your donors. You can let your donors and others research nonprofits that align with their interests, including by issue area, population served, and more. If you're a CF Insights member interested in learning more about taking advantage of this benefit, and even if you're not a CF Insights member and would like to get this as a standalone service, you don't need to be a member to get access to this, only for the discount, you can let us know. And I'll show my contact info on the last slide. So how can community foundations support our work? Community foundations across the country are highly encouraged to participate in our annual Columbus survey, which is crucial to inform our ongoing research on the field, including our annual snapshot and findings, including all of those that I mentioned as part of this session. Becoming a member of CF Insights gets you near instant access to all of the data discussed today and continuous access to new data as it comes in. Your membership dues also help support our ongoing work to bring you the latest information on the field and the development of new ways to bring you that information. Now, before we turn it over for questions, I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of our other offerings and a little bit about something we're excited to launch very soon. So first, I want to mention our brand new community leadership assessment tool, which allows community foundations to track their level of engagement in over 40 different dimensions of community leadership, including examples as humility, community knowledge, networks, relationships, and more. And to give you an idea of how this tool was designed, I'm going to show you two of its items as a quick example. So all of these are different dimensions. All of these different dimensions are plotted on a 7-point scale from minimal on the left to strong on the right. And we also provide written, clearly stated guideposts for helping you determine where you would plot your community foundation on the scale along these different dimensions. Our first example here is under the section on the foundation's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the degree to which the foundation recognizes the role of historical power imbalances along the lines of race, class, culture, and more. On the minimal side, the foundation does not apply this type of lens to its work. Under basic, the foundation is saying that it recognizes these power imbalances, but hasn't yet identified or mobilized the tools and resources it would need to leverage to address them. Under moderate, the foundation recognizes the tools it needs to address these factors, and under strong, the foundation is explicit when speaking about historical power imbalances, addresses them internally and externally, and applies this lens to all aspects of its work. Our second example, and our last example, is around the concept of having an asset-based perspective as opposed to a deficit-based perspective, which speaks to whether the community foundation sees the community they serve as home to a set of issues and problems that they are there to solve or fix, or whether they recognize the types of expertise, the lived experiences, and the unique perspectives, the assets, in other words, of their stakeholders and community members, and whether the foundation not just values those assets, but leverages them in active partnership. At the foundation level, this tool was designed to inform practice, and foundation staff should dedicate time to discuss the results, particularly if there were any major differences in responses among staff members or areas where ratings may have skewed a little bit low. You can access the print version of the tool as a PDF at the link on the slide, share it with your team, complete the assessment individually or as a group exercise. And at the field level, results from this tool are going to be aggregated by CF Insights to provide a broader perspective on how foundations are engaging in community leadership work. We encourage everyone who completes the assessment to submit their responses to us at candid.org/howwelead to help inform our ongoing research on where the field is and where it's going, lift up case studies, and allow us to uncover key differences in how segments of the field focus on different dimensions of community leadership. Moving on to another offering that I want to mention very quickly, given the unpredictable nature of the economy this year in light of the ongoing pandemic, I did want to mention our economic scenario planning tool. This tool has been around for a very long time, and it helps you perform a stress test of your community foundation's current operating model across up to 3 different scenarios in the context of external forces and variables like the performance of the investment market and changes in donor behavior. And to be completed in a couple of hours, only requiring the input of a few data points to generate 5-year models. With this tool, you can see comparisons in asset growth, fundraising, revenues earned, months of cash in your reserve, and more, and other indicators of sustainability and performance under expected, pessimistic, and optimistic scenarios. You can also model these scenarios out over a 5-year period and compare the different scenarios per year, as you can see here on this example, in a single set of charts. All of these charts are automatically generated right in the same Excel file that you use to input your data. The tool is free for anyone to download from cfinsights.org, and it always will be. We provide a template to present the results of the exercise internally, and we offer fee-based consulting services to help guide you through the process of completing the model and presenting the results as well. If you want to learn more about this consulting service, please reach out at any time. Again, the contact information will be up in just a matter of moments. And then finally, before we turn it over to the audience, I'm particularly excited to share this. In early 2021, we're going to be launching a brand new community site for CF Insights members. On our community site, you can start and join conversations with other members, share and download sample documents and other resources from us and each other, and more easily request support, dashboards, data sets, and more directly from our team. This is going to be a new addition to the core CF Insights member experience, and there will also be ways on the new site when it launches for non-members to engage with us and request information from us as well. We're hard at work building this new resource as we speak. It is an active, ongoing project right now, and we will be looking to launch it very, very early in the new year. So at this point, I would like to invite questions from the audience. I'll keep my contact information up on the slide, and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to see what questions have come in. Elizabeth.
Absolutely. Thank you, David, for taking us through all of that information. I know I've been clicking around here myself to kind of do a deeper dive. So thank you for letting us know what the trends are for the 2019 fiscal year. The first question I wanted to start out with comes from Catherine. And Catherine wants to know if the data from the survey is available to everyone on the website without particularly having to log in to access the full data set. Is that what you were showing us on that last assets page to download from?
Yes, absolutely. So I could actually go back to that site just to kind of show you how that works. But if you click this link right here, and I hesitate to do it only because we're sharing the screen live, but I'm happy to see if it'll work live, but it should. You click that link and it'll download an Excel, and you'll get a list of all of the community foundations that participated in the survey this year, and in separate columns there are assets, gifts, and grants. And on this site itself, and the Excel file is actually opening, so I can have that there. On the data list section of the site itself, you'll not only see assets, fiscal year end, but and here's the Excel file, Catherine. So these are all the foundations. You have your fiscal year end date, assets, gifts, and grants, and that goes all the way down. If something is missing, we'll have a note there saying that they did not report those data points for this particular year. But what I wanted to show you is that if you go to these different lists, there are also other data points that you can see. So for each one of these foundations, right, you can see their distribution rate, and then you could see how many of their assets are in DAFs. If you go to the number of transactions, you can see all of that's their total gift and grant transactions. You could also see the average transaction size. And if you go to gifts per capita, you can see the gifts per capita and also the population of the area served. So there are several other data points that you can access for free, no login required from this website. But to get all of a lot of the deeper detail that I spoke about in the aggregate, that would require a login to the database to get access to. And for some of that data as well, membership with CF Insights.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Alex has a great question here for us, which I'm sure you fielded a number of times. But Alex is curious how Candid shares the data between our various products and services, the data that's collected through CF Insights versus perhaps what we collect through GuideStar versus, maybe what we are sharing from 990s through Foundation Directory Online. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It is also a very common question. And I would love to have this conversation, let's say in a few months' time, without saying too much. But yes, right now we certainly recognize the fact that these databases have some overlap, not too much overlap, probably less than you might expect, but certainly some overlap. So yes, we are asking for some of the same information twice, in some cases even 3 times. We fully recognize that. We are working on a solution to that particular issue. So I would just say stay tuned on that. But otherwise, if you need help with a particular platform, right? So if you need help with CF Insights, I'm the person to reach out to. If you need assistance with filling out your GuideStar profile, I can get you in touch with somebody on the team to help you with that. And if you need assistance with filling out other databases of ours, if we're asking for other types of data, I can get you in touch with those folks as well.
Absolutely. It's definitely a priority here at Candid to make sure, it's a little bit more of a cohesive experience for all of our users. But it takes some time on the back end, which I'm sure, David, you could speak to offline on a different day. Our next question here comes from Ryan. Ryan wants to know, does CF Insights anticipate developing resources for community foundations to be able to measure and report their community impact?
To measure and report their community impact. That is certainly on the radar. And it's a conversation we do often have. I would say that the best way we have to help collect things like outcomes, which can mean very many different things for different organizations. There is a section for that on the GuideStar profile. I'm happy to give you more information about that offline, but certainly there's a section where you can define what your outcomes are and what you're looking to measure. Say, I'm just throwing an example out here, but graduation rates or literacy rates or things like that, meal served, just to name fairly simple examples, but there's a way to share that on the GuideStar profile. Now, as far as CF Insights goes, I would refer to my answer to the previous question. We're hard at work having these different databases speak to each other in a more cohesive manner. So it would be wonderful if we were able to pull some of that data in to the CF Insights experience as well, or help inform some of that benchmarking to have foundations speak to each other if they're finding success in a particular in a particular issue area, let's say, and they're seeing progress in a particular issue area. So that's another one I would say stay tuned to see on the CF Insights side. But yes, there's a way to do that on the GuideStar side currently.
Great, thank you for fielding that. And then just some context to Ryan's question. Some of us want to move away from assets under management and money in, money out benchmarking to how we leverage our assets, financial and otherwise, to improve communities, moving from transactional to transformational. So I think you definitely spoke to that, and Ryan saying thank you in the chat. So feel free to continue submitting your questions that we have here. Would there be a good resource that folks could reference in terms of compensation? Andre has a question in terms of, how much could he potentially pay himself as the CEO? Kind of, is there any benchmarking for that to kind of see what the standards are for the field?
Yeah, it's a little broader. I guess I'm not sure if you're asking about community foundations specifically, but if we broaden the scope a little bit, if you search for the nonprofit compensation report, I believe the latest edition of that came out very, very recently. Yeah, and that was put out by Candid very recently. Not something that I worked on personally, but yes, there is a nonprofit compensation report that can be purchased. And I would say that that's the best resource. But again, if you want to reach out with a particular question around compensation, certainly feel free to reach out, and we could see if there are other resources that might, maybe hone in on what the type of organization you're specifically curious about.
Thank you for that, David. And I think those are all the questions that we have at this point in time. I'll give everyone another moment to submit anything else that might be top of mind. But any final words or recommendations for folks who may be, interacting with the data for the first time?
Yeah, I guess just more of a general statement of do not hesitate to reach out. I know that I've presented a lot of information today and a few other resources as well. So if you want to learn more about the Community Leadership Assessment Tool, which is another way, by the way, I should mention, of hopefully in the future allowing community foundations to benchmark against each other outside of using financial-based metrics. Or if you want to learn more about the Guides to Our Local Nonprofit Directory, economic scenario planning, or just want to get started with sharing data with us, please, please, please do not hesitate whatsoever to reach out to me. And I will be more than happy to help you. And if I can't help you, connect you with a colleague who absolutely can.
Wonderful. With that, I will say thank you to everyone who's still on the line with us for spending your morning or your afternoon with us, wherever you may be in the country right now. We invite you to start exploring the Columbus survey on your own, and reach out to David with any questions that you might have. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.